If you're a collector of any kind, be it games, merchandise, videos, DVDs, you name it, there's always going to be something in your collection that you're trying to get hold of that's quite hard to find. That's true with Mastertronic games as well. Most of the Mastertronic Commodore 64 games are quite easy to get hold of. They're readily available on eBay and so forth, but there's a few games that are quite rare, quite hard to find, and that's what this video is all about. So we're going to look at the 5 rarest Mastertronic games, but before that I'm going to have a quick mention for Ultimate Combat Mission. This was considered by me and other Mastertronic collectors to be one of the more rare games to find. It only sold about 7,000 copies back in the day, and I think the reason for that was because if you take a quick look at the game, it quite obviously rips off the sprites from Commando, and I suspect that the publishers of Commando, which were Elite Software, had a bit of a word with Mastertronic and asked them to pull it from sale. So this was considered the rarest of the mad releases, and it did take me over a year to find a copy, but actually nowadays you can find 2 or 3 copies on eBay quite readily available, so I'm not quite sure where they've suddenly sprung up from, but that does fall out of the top 5 rarest games simply because it's not actually as rare as it first appeared. So on to the 5 rarest Mastertronic Commodore 64 games in my opinion, and in 5th place is Rugby Manager, Mastertronic Plus, released from 1990. This is one of the last Mastertronic releases in fact, and only sold just over 3,000 copies, which might explain why it's so hard to find. At the moment there's just a single copy of it available on eBay, and it doesn't show up very often at all. It's a terrible game, to be honest, and definitely wasn't worth the $2.99, which might explain why there's very few copies of it available. There are a couple of other games that released at roughly the same time as this game, T-Bird and Sidewinder 2. They're both quite easy to find on eBay. Obviously probably more appealing games because they were shoot-em-ups. But even though they sold less copies, they're much easier to find. And I think that's because there's a lot of new old stock copies of this era of games available. So copies that never actually went out into the wild, into shops and so on, and have just been picked up from sort of bulk warehouse lots over the years. But for some reason Rugby Manager doesn't seem to come up in those kind of scenarios, and is quite hard to find. As I said, awful game, definitely not worth playing, but if you're going to complete the collection you need to find a copy of it. In 4th place on the rarest games list, Ball Blazer, re-released on the Ricochet packaging, originally published by Activision, and there was 10,000 copies of this sold on the Commodore 64, so I'm not really sure why it's considered to be so rare, or why it doesn't show up on eBay. One theory I've got is it's possibly hard to find because it's a really good game and nobody actually wants to sell it, whereas all the other games are pretty crap and no one seems to mind selling them on. As I say, not many copies available on eBay. It does show up now and then. I've seen a couple of copies I think since I started my collection, one of which I bought obviously, and the original Activision version you can pick up for like 99p. It's also available on compilations, so if you want to play the game it's quite easy to find, but if you want to complete a Mastertronic Commodore 64 collection you're going to have to search around fairly hard for this one. In 3rd place is another Ricochet release from 1988. This is the re-release of How to Be a Complete Bastard. This one really did take some finding. It was over a year and a half until I saw a copy of it on eBay. When I finally got a copy it cost me £5. It's the most expensive game of all the Mastertronic games that I bought. Probably one of the reasons it's hard to find is that it only sold about 4,000 copies, less than that in fact, and it's a pretty awful game. Possibly another reason why it's so rare is that parents didn't actually let their kids buy a copy of it simply because of the nature of the game and the fact it's got the word bastard in the title. Probably didn't go down too well with parents. It's not really worth playing. It's a terrible game, as you can see from the footage being shown. Not particularly nice graphics and a really complicated control system. But again, if you want to buy a copy you're going to have to search around quite hard for it. No copies on eBay at present. And as I said, this was the most expensive of all the Mastertronic games I actually picked up over the last 2.5 years. If you do manage to find a copy of it, you're likely to pay quite a lot. The last copy I did see on eBay after I'd bought my copy was going for nearly £15. So be prepared to put your hands in your pocket if you do want to buy a copy of this game. The second rarest game, and this might come as a surprise to you given how long it took me to find a copy, is Pigs in Space. This is the oldest game in this top 5 rarest, released in 1984, and the theory as to why it's so hard to find is probably because it was withdrawn from sale at some point. The reason being that it's got a likeness to the Konami arcade game Puyan, and also it may have been a copyright issue with the Jim Henson people, who obviously were using Pigs in Space with their Muppets at the time. It had already been released by Ace Software, which was the Darling Brothers' own brand label, and copies of that version pop up fairly frequently on eBay. There's one on there as I speak, in fact. The Mastertronic version sold around 10,000 copies compared to sort of 30,000 for most similar games of that era. So that does give extra credence to the suggestion that it was withdrawn from sale at some point. No confirmation of that from anyone, that's just theoretical, but it's a shame really in a way, because it's one of the better ones of those early Darling Brothers releases, and yet for some reason it's really hard to find. The last copy that went on eBay went for over £18 and I didn't win it. The copy before that was part of a bundle which went quite cheaply for like £4 or £5 and was picked up by another collector. Those are the only two copies I've seen on eBay in 2.5 years of collecting, and as you may recall, I got my copy donated to me by a fellow collector over in Norway, which I'm very thankful for, otherwise I would effectively still be collecting the Mastertronic games. So that brings me to what I consider to be the rarest Commodore 64 Mastertronic game, and this is Aqua, which came on this complimentary free cassette from Mastertronic, which I don't know where this came from. It didn't come from the front of a magazine. I can only assume it was given out at trade shows. I've got no idea exactly when it was given out, sometime around 1984, and I don't know the quantities, which is why I consider it to be the rarest. There could only be 100 copies of this out there. Luckily I picked mine up from a retro gaming online shop for just £2, but the only other copy I've ever seen on eBay in the last 2.5 years was going for 15 quid. It's also, apart from Ball Blazer, really the only game really worth playing out of the top 5 rarest games. So good luck with trying to find a copy of that. As I said, no idea how many of them are out there. There are a few, but expect to pay at least £10 to £15 for a copy unless you get lucky and find it as part of a bundle. So that sums up the top 5 rarest Commodore 64 Mastertronic games that I'm aware of. There is one game that I don't believe exists. There's evidence that it does exist, there's evidence that it doesn't. It's Five-A-Side Soccer, which was supposedly released on the MAD packaging in 1986. It's a re-release of a game originally published by Analog Software. The evidence that it exists is that the Amstrad version definitely exists and appears on eBay quite frequently. In fact, you'll find copies on there right now. A Commodore 64 disc version exists for sure. I've seen those on eBay too. That was only released in America. Mastertronic sales figures say that almost 15,000 copies of this game were sold on the Commodore 64. And there's a scan of the Commodore 64 cover available online. So for all intents and purposes it must exist, but then I asked the question, if it sold 15,000 copies, where are they all? There's games with much lower sales figures than that from the same sort of era that are readily available on eBay and in online shops. Where is this mythical Five-A-Side Soccer for the Commodore 64? Also, I've got further evidence that it doesn't exist. It's not really covered by any of the online Commodore 64 sites. There's a brief mention of it being a Mastertronic release on GameBase 64, but Lemon 64 doesn't acknowledge it as a Mastertronic release, only as the original Analog release. None of those sites have got any scans of the cover. The only place I found a scan of the cover was just a random Commodore 64 site. So no other collector that I'm aware of has a copy of it. If you've got one, let me know, because as I say, I don't think it actually exists. I also have the Mastertronic catalogue from around 1986, which shows that it doesn't appear as a release for the Commodore 64 when there's games that were released after that appear on this list. It also mentions the Amstrad version in that catalogue, but not the Commodore 64 version. So I don't know what to say. I've given up on ever finding a copy. I don't believe it exists. However, I've still got the search going on eBay. It's been going for over 2.5 years. Never seen a copy of it come up. So if it ever does pop up, then the Mastertronic Chronicles will have one more review episode to come. But I've basically given up hope of it ever showing up, and I don't believe it exists. But if it does exist, it's definitely the rarest of all the Mastertronic Commodore 64 games.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
2, 1, 0.